The August heat in Miami was relentless. Even at 7 in the evening, the air felt thick and suffocating, clinging to skin like wet fabric. Jonathan Rivera loosened his tie as he walked through the parking garage beneath the glass tower where his office occupied the 12th floor. His footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, each step deliberate, measured. He'd made this walk thousands of times over the past 6 years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, everything felt different. His silver Honda Accord sat in its usual spot, covered in a thin layer of dust from the construction happening 2 blocks over. Jonathan paused before unlocking it, glancing around the dimly lit garage. A few other cars remained scattered throughout the space, their owners probably working late like he'd claimed to be. But Jonathan hadn't been working. For the past 3 hours, he'd been sitting in an empty conference room, staring at spreadsheets that swam before his eyes, numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times he recalculated them. $347,000. That's what he owed. The number had been haunting him for months, growing larger with each passing week as interest compounded and creditors became more aggressive. It started innocently enough, a business expansion that seemed promising, a real estate investment that his partner assured him was a sure thing, a loan to cover temporary cash flow issues. Then the market shifted. The partner disappeared. The cash flow never recovered. Jonathan slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. Through the windshield, he could see the exit ramp spiraling upward toward street level, toward home, toward Camilla, beautiful, trusting Camilla, who believed every excuse he'd given for the late nights and the worried phone calls he took in the other room. She didn't know about the second mortgage he'd taken out on their house. She didn't know about the threatening messages from the loan sharks he'd been foolish enough to approach when the banks turned him down. She didn't know that the man she'd married was drowning, sinking deeper every day and had stopped trying to swim to the surface. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking space, but instead of heading toward the exit, he found himself driving deeper into the garage, down to the lower levels where even fewer cars sat in the shadows. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Camilla wondering when he'd be home for dinner. He ignored it. His hands were shaking now, a tremor that started in his fingers and worked its way up his arms. The lowest level of the garage was nearly empty. Jonathan pulled into a corner spot far from the elevator and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and complete, broken only by the faint drip of water from a pipe somewhere in the darkness. He sat there for 15 minutes, maybe 20, staring at nothing, thinking about everything. His phone buzzed again. This time he pulled it out and looked at the screen. Camilla's smiling face lit up the display, a photo from their vacation to Key West 2 years ago, back when he still slept through the night and didn't wake up in cold sweats thinking about money. He silenced the call and set the phone on the passenger seat. His wallet followed, landing with a soft thud on top of his phone. Jonathan reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an envelope he'd hidden there 3 days ago. Inside was everything he needed: a new driver's license with a different name, a social security card that had cost him $5,000 from a contact at work who knew people who specialized in these things, and $15,000 in cash, withdrawn in small amounts over the past 2 months from ATMs across the city. It was all he'd been able to scrape together without raising red flags. He studied the license. The photo was his, taken at a CVS photo booth where no one paid attention. But the name was different. John Alvarez. He'd chosen the name carefully, common enough to blend in, Hispanic like his actual heritage, easy to remember. John Alvarez from Albuquerque, New Mexico, age 35, no wife, no business, no debts, no past. The plan had been forming in his mind for weeks, ever since Victor Reyes, the man he owed the most money to, had sent 2 men to his office with a message: pay by the end of the month or they'd collect in other ways. They didn't specify what those other ways might be, but Jonathan's imagination filled in the blanks. He'd seen enough movies, heard enough stories. Men like Reyes didn't make idle threats. He could disappear. The thought had come to him late one night as he lay awake next to his sleeping wife, listening to her breathe, knowing he was failing her. He could simply vanish and all of his problems would vanish with him. The debts, the threats, the suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe, all of it would be gone. Camilla would be devastated, but she'd be safe. The life insurance policy would pay out eventually. She could start over, find someone better, someone who wasn't a failure. Jonathan looked at the license again, at the face that was his but wasn't, at the name that felt foreign in his mind. Could he really do this? Could he walk away from everything? His wife, his life, his identity, and become someone else? His phone buzzed a third time. Not a call this time, but a text message. He picked it up and read it. Camilla, dinner's ready. Love you. Drive safe. The words hit him like a physical blow. Love you. When was the last time he'd said those words and meant them, without the weight of guilt crushing down on every syllable? When was the last time he'd been the man she thought she'd married? He set the phone down, placed his wallet next to it, and opened the car door. The air in the garage was cooler than outside, but still carried that Miami humidity, that heavy wetness that made everything feel sluggish and difficult. Jonathan stood beside the car, looking at the phone and wallet sitting on the passenger seat like abandoned artifacts of a life he was about to leave behind. He thought about calling her, hearing her voice one more time, but what would he say? How could he explain what he was about to do? There were no words that would make this okay, no explanation that would ease the pain he was about to cause. Instead, he pocketed the envelope with his new identity, closed the car door, and walked toward the garage's emergency exit stairwell. Each step felt surreal, like he was watching himself from a distance, a spectator to his own disappearance. The stairwell door was heavy, and it closed behind him with a final-sounding clang that echoed through the empty garage. Jonathan Rivera climbed the stairs and emerged onto a side street he'd scouted earlier in the week, where a used motorcycle he'd purchased with cash was parked beneath a broken streetlight. He'd never owned a motorcycle before, but John Alvarez did. John Alvarez was the kind of man who traveled light, who didn't leave traces, who could disappear into the night and never look back. He put on the helmet he'd stashed in the bike's storage compartment and started the engine. The rumble was loud in the quiet street, but no one came to investigate. This part of downtown emptied out after business hours, leaving only the homeless and the occasional police patrol. Jonathan had timed everything carefully. As he pulled away from the curb, heading west toward the interstate that would take him out of Miami, and toward a future he'd fabricated from desperation and fear, he didn't look back. Looking back would make it real in a way he wasn't ready to face. Looking back would remind him of what he was doing, not just to Camilla, but to himself. The motorcycle carried him through the humid night, past palm trees and strip malls, past the life he was leaving behind. In his mind, he repeated his new name like a mantra. John Alvarez, John Alvarez, John Alvarez. By the time he reached the city limits, Jonathan Rivera was already beginning to feel like a memory, a ghost, a man who had simply stopped existing. Behind him, in a parking garage in downtown Miami, a silver Honda Accord sat abandoned with a cell phone and wallet on the passenger seat, waiting to be discovered, waiting to launch a mystery that would consume the city, devastate a woman who deserved better, and eventually become one of the most talked about disappearances in Miami's history. But Jonathan didn't think about that as he drove into the darkness. He thought only about escape, about the promise of a blank slate, about becoming someone new. He thought about survival. He didn't think about the price. Camila Rivera didn't panic when Jonathan didn't come home that night. At first, she was annoyed. She'd made his favorite meal, arroz con pollo with black beans and maduros, and had even stopped by the bakery on Calle Ocho to pick up the guava pastelitos he loved. By 9 o'clock, the food had gone cold on the kitchen table, and she'd wrapped everything in aluminum foil, sliding the plates into the refrigerator with more force than necessary. She called his cell phone twice. Both times it rang until voicemail picked up, Jonathan's professional voice telling her to leave a message. She didn't. What was the point? He'd see the missed calls and know she was upset. Let him feel guilty, she thought. Let him come home with an apology, and that sheepish smile he always used when he knew he'd messed up. By midnight, annoyance had shifted to worry. Camilla sat on their cream-colored couch, the television playing a late-night talk show she wasn't watching, her phone clutched in her hand. She'd called 6 more times. She'd texted asking if he was okay, if he was working late, if he'd decided to grab drinks with colleagues. No response. The silence was deafening. The girl. At 2 in the morning, she called Miami-Dade Police Department's non-emergency line. The dispatcher was professional but unhelpful. An adult missing for a few hours wasn't unusual, she explained. People worked late, stopped for drinks, lost track of time. Give it 24 hours. If he still hasn't shown up, file a missing persons report. Camilla barely slept. She dozed on the couch in fits and starts, jolting awake every time she heard a car pass on their quiet street in Coral Gables, hoping it was Jonathan's Honda pulling into the driveway. But morning came with an empty driveway and a silence that felt heavier than the humid August air. She called his office at 8 o'clock sharp. His assistant, Patricia, sounded confused. He left around 7 last night, she said. Said he was heading home. Is everything okay? I don't know, Camilla admitted, her voice cracking. He never made it home. Patricia's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Oh my God. Camilla, have you called the police? They said to wait 24 hours. Screw that. My cousin works in the homicide unit. Let me make a call. Within an hour, 2 uniformed officers were standing in Camilla's living room, asking questions she couldn't answer. Had Jonathan seemed upset lately? Had he mentioned any problems at work? Any enemies? Financial troubles? The questions felt invasive, accusatory, as if they were suggesting Jonathan had done something wrong, or worse, that she should have seen something coming. He was fine, she insisted, wringing her hands. Everything was fine. He's been working a lot lately, but that's normal. He's always been dedicated to his business. The officers exchanged a glance she couldn't interpret. The older one, a heavy-set man with gray at his temples, pulled out a notebook. Mrs. Rivera, we're going to need the make and model of your husband's vehicle, his license plate number, and a recent photograph. We'll issue a bolo, be on the lookout, and start checking hospitals, traffic accidents, that sort of thing. Camilla provided everything they asked for, her hands shaking as she pulled Jonathan's photo from her wallet. It was from their anniversary dinner 3 months ago, both of them dressed up, Jonathan in a navy suit that brought out his dark eyes. He looked happy in the photo. He looked like a man who had everything to live for. The discovery of Jonathan's car came 36 hours after he vanished. A Miami Beach police officer noticed the Honda Accord in a parking lot near South Point Park, just blocks from the ocean. The car had been there at least a day, maybe longer. A parking ticket flapped under the windshield wiper, issued the morning after Jonathan disappeared. Camilla stood next to Detective Marcus Webb as crime scene technicians photographed the vehicle from every angle. The August sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat dripped down her back, but she barely noticed. All she could focus on was the car, Jonathan's car, and what it meant that it was here, abandoned, with his phone and wallet sitting on the passenger seat like offerings left behind. Why would he leave everything? She whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Detective Webb or herself. Webb was a tall black man in his mid-40s with kind eyes that had seen too much. He'd been assigned to the case that morning, after the car was discovered. We don't know yet, Mrs. Rivera, but we're going to find out. They processed the car for fingerprints, for DNA, for any trace of evidence that might explain what happened to Jonathan Rivera. The phone's battery was dead, but technicians would charge it and comb through his recent calls, messages, and browsing history. The wallet contained his driver's license, credit cards, $63 in cash, and a photo of Camilla from their wedding day. There's no sign of a struggle, Webb said, studying the vehicle's interior. No blood, no damage. The keys were still in the ignition. What does that mean? Camilla asked, though she was afraid of the answer. It could mean a lot of things. Maybe he met someone here voluntarily. Maybe he went for a walk on the beach and something happened. Maybe he stopped himself, but Camilla knew what he wasn't saying. Maybe he jumped, she finished, her voice hollow. Webb's expression softened. We're not ruling anything out yet. Coast Guard's been notified. They'll search the waters. We're also checking security cameras in the area, talking to anyone who might have seen something. The news broke that evening. Channel 7 led with it. Local businessman missing. Car found abandoned near beach. Camilla watched herself on television, footage from earlier that day when reporters had ambushed her outside her house. She looked pale, exhausted, like a ghost of herself. The woman on the screen pleaded for anyone with information to come forward, her voice breaking as she begged Jonathan to come home if he was watching. She didn't recognize that woman. That wasn't her. That was someone whose world had shattered in the space of 2 days. Someone who didn't understand how her husband could simply vanish into thin air. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Webb assembled a team, and suddenly Camilla's life was under a microscope. They wanted to know everything about Jonathan, his business, his finances, his habits, his friends. They interviewed his colleagues, his clients, the barista at the coffee shop he visited every morning. They pulled his bank records, his credit card statements, his email accounts. What they found began to paint a picture Camilla didn't recognize. Jonathan's business was hemorrhaging money. He'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without telling her. There were cash withdrawals, large ones, going back months. Phone calls to numbers that led nowhere. Meetings with people whose names meant nothing to her. Did you know your husband owed $347,000? Webb asked her during one of their many meetings, his voice careful as if he was afraid she might break. Camilla stared at him. The number incomprehensible. That's not possible. We're doing fine. We have savings. But even as she said it, she realized she didn't actually know. Jonathan had always handled the finances. She'd trusted him completely. Mrs. Rivera, some of these debts, they're not to banks or legitimate lending institutions. We think your husband may have been involved with some dangerous people. The word hung in the air between them. Kidnapping. It was what everyone was starting to whisper. What the news anchors speculated about in their carefully neutral tones. Businessman with debts to criminals disappears. Car abandoned. No body found. The implication was clear. Camilla's appearance on the news became more desperate. Patricia helped her coordinate with local stations, and soon she was everywhere. Morning shows, evening news, cable networks that picked up the story. She held up Jonathan's photo, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her face. Please, if anyone knows anything about my husband, if you've seen him, if you know where he is, please come forward. We just want him home safely. Tips flooded in. Jonathan had been seen in Orlando, in Tampa, in Key West. He'd been spotted getting on a cruise ship, boarding a plane to Mexico, walking through a Walmart in Homestead. Every lead was investigated. Every single one led nowhere. Weeks turned into months. The story faded from the news cycle, replaced by hurricanes and elections and celebrity scandals. The investigation continued, but even Detective Webb's optimism began to fade. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, without any trace of Jonathan beyond that abandoned car, there was nowhere left to look. These cases, Webb told her one gray October afternoon, 6 months after Jonathan vanished, sometimes they just go cold. People don't want to hear that, but it's the truth. Without new evidence, without a break in the case. He's not dead, Camilla insisted, though she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. I would know if he was dead. I would feel it. But what she felt was emptiness, a void where her husband used to be, a silence that no amount of searching could fill. At night she lay in their bed staring at the ceiling and wondered if she'd ever really known Jonathan at all. Had there been signs she'd missed, clues she'd ignored, or had he simply been that good at hiding who he really was, what he was really going through? The bank foreclosed on their house in 2010. Camilla couldn't afford the payments, not with the second mortgage she hadn't known existed. She moved into a small apartment in Kendall, packed away Jonathan's belongings in boxes she couldn't bring herself to open, and tried to figure out how to live in a world where her husband was neither present nor confirmed dead, just gone, as if he'd never existed at all. In 2014, after 6 years of silence, the court declared Jonathan Rivera legally dead. Camilla signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake, her grief calcified into something harder, something that felt like acceptance but was really just exhaustion. The life insurance paid out. She took the money and moved to Jacksonville, as far from Miami as she could get while staying in Florida, and tried to build a life from the ruins of the one she'd lost. She never stopped wondering. Even as years passed, even as she learned to sleep through the night and smile at strangers and go entire days without thinking about Jonathan, there was always a part of her that wondered, what happened to you? Where did you go? And the question that haunted her most of all, did you leave or were you taken? The answer was out there, waiting, but it would be 8 more years before it found her. John Alvarez woke up at 6:15 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock buzzing on the nightstand. The Texas sun was already streaming through the blinds of the modest 3-bedroom house on Cypress Street in Longview, a small city tucked in the northeastern corner of the state, where nothing much happened, and that was exactly the point. He reached over to silence the alarm, careful not to wake the woman sleeping beside him. Sarah stirred anyway, rolling toward him with a sleepy smile. "Morning," she mumbled, her blonde hair tangled on the pillow. "Morning," he replied, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Go back to sleep. I've got that early showing in Marshall." She made a contented sound and burrowed deeper into the blankets. John, he thought of himself only as John now, had trained himself over 14 years to respond to nothing else, slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the bathroom. The face that looked back at him from the mirror was older, lined with creases that hadn't been there in 2008. His hair, once thick and dark, was now peppered with gray at the temples. He'd grown a beard in those first few months after leaving Miami, and he'd kept it ever since. It changed his face enough that he felt safer, more distant from the man he used to be. He showered, shaved carefully around the beard, and dressed in the business casual attire of a successful small-town real estate agent. Khakis, a button-down shirt, leather shoes that were comfortable enough for showing houses all day. By 6:45, he was in the kitchen making coffee, scrolling through his phone to check the listings he'd be showing today. "Dad?" A teenage voice called from upstairs. "Can you drive me to school? I missed the bus yesterday, and Coach said if I'm late again, I'm off the team." John looked up as his son, their son, came thundering down the stairs. Kyle was 16, tall and gangly, with Sarah's blue eyes and a mop of brown hair that he refused to cut despite both parents' requests. He was a good kid, made decent grades, played baseball, stayed out of trouble for the most part. "Grab a granola bar and let's go," John said, pocketing his phone. "I need to be in Marshall by 8. Kyle rummaged through the pantry, emerged with a protein bar and followed his father to the white Ford F-150 parked in the driveway. It was a far cry from the luxury sedan Jonathan Rivera used to drive, but John Alvarez was a different kind of man. Practical, modest, careful. The drive to Longview High School took 12 minutes. Kyle talked about the baseball game coming up on Friday, about a girl in his English class who might or might not like him back, about whether John thought he'd get the truck when he turned 17. Normal teenage concerns. The concerns of a kid who'd grown up in a stable home with two parents who loved him, who'd never known hunger or fear or instability. John listened and made appropriate responses, but part of his mind was elsewhere, calculating the commission he'd make if he closed the Marshall deal, mentally reviewing his schedule for the rest of the week. This was his life now. Real estate in East Texas, a wife who taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, 2 kids who called him dad, and had no idea their father was living under a stolen identity. He'd met Sarah in 2009, less than a year after he'd arrived in Longview. She'd been recently divorced, working as a substitute teacher, lonely in the way people in small towns could be when they felt like everyone knew their business. John had been selling houses even then, though with a different agency, still finding his footing in a new life. They'd met at a church picnic. He'd started attending to blend in, to seem normal and trustworthy, and she'd been drawn to his quiet intensity, his careful attention when she spoke, the sense that he was a man who'd lived through something difficult and come out the other side. She had no idea how right she was. They dated for 6 months before he proposed. It felt fast, but Sarah said yes without hesitation, and they were married in a simple ceremony at the Baptist Church on Main Street. Kyle was born in 2006, Sarah's son from her first marriage, who John had adopted and raised as his own. Their daughter Emma came along in 2010, a surprise pregnancy that cemented their family unit. John loved them. That was the strangest part, the part that kept him awake some nights when the guilt crept in. He genuinely loved this life he'd built on a foundation of lies. Sarah was kind and patient, nothing like. He forced himself not to complete that thought. Kyle and Emma were great kids. The house was paid for. He'd bought it with cash, what was left of the $15,000 he'd fled Miami with, combined with Sarah's modest savings. His real estate business was successful enough to keep them comfortable. He'd become John Alvarez so completely that sometimes Jonathan Rivera felt like a character he'd seen in a movie once, a fiction that had nothing to do with him. After dropping Kyle at school, John drove the 45 minutes to Marshall, a slightly larger town where he'd been cultivating clients for the past few years. The property he was showing was a foreclosure, a 3-bedroom ranch that needed work but had good bones and a sizable lot. The clients were a young couple relocating for work, eager to get more house for their money than they could in Dallas. The showing went well. By noon, they were talking seriously about making an offer. John walked them through the negotiation possibilities, explained the inspection process, answered their questions with the easy competence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. They shook hands on the front lawn, the husband promising to call by the end of the day with their decision. John sat in his truck afterward, AC blasting against the Texas heat, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was the kind of success that felt real because it was built on effort and skill, not borrowed money and desperation. John Alvarez was good at his job. People trusted him. He'd made a life that mattered. His phone rang. "Sarah." "Hey, hun," he answered. "Hi. How'd it go?" "Really well. I think they're going to make an offer." "That's wonderful. Listen, Emma's dance recital is at 7 tonight. You'll be back in time, right?" He'd forgotten. "Absolutely. Wouldn't miss it. You said that about her last recital and you were 40 minutes late. This time will be different, I promise." They chatted for a few more minutes before hanging up. John checked his other messages, a client asking about properties in Gilmer, his broker forwarding some new listings, a reminder about his dentist appointment next week. Normal life, busy but manageable, safe. He stopped for lunch at a barbecue place off Highway 59, ordering brisket and coleslaw and sweet tea so sugary it made his teeth ache. The restaurant was full of locals, men in work boots and sun-faded caps, families with young children, elderly couples who probably ate here every Tuesday. No one looked at him twice. He was just John, the real estate guy, pleasant and unmemorable. The afternoon was filled with paperwork and phone calls. He worked from his home office, a converted spare bedroom where Sarah had helped him set up a desk and filing cabinets. Through the window, he could see their backyard, Emma's swing set, the garden Sarah tended with varying success, the trampoline that Kyle had begged for 3 Christmases ago and barely used anymore. At 6:30, Sarah came home with Emma, who immediately rushed to her room to get ready for the recital. She was 12, still young enough to be excited about performing, not yet self-conscious about her body or her abilities. John helped her with the complicated bun her dance teacher required, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he pinned and sprayed. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little, but I know all the steps. You're going to be amazing." The recital was held at the middle school auditorium, packed with proud parents armed with cameras and smartphones. John sat between Sarah and Kyle, watching as Emma and her classmates performed a routine to some pop song he didn't recognize. Emma was in the front row, her face serious with concentration, her movements precise. When it was over and the audience applauded, she beamed with pride. She was perfect, Sarah whispered, squeezing John's hand. She really was, he agreed, and meant it. They took Emma out for ice cream afterward. The 4 of them crowded into a booth at the Dairy Queen on Judson Road. Emma couldn't stop talking about the performance, replaying every moment, asking if they'd seen when she'd done the turn perfectly, when Mackenzie had almost forgotten the choreography but covered it well. John watched his family, because that's what they were, weren't they? His family, and felt a contentment that was almost painful in its intensity. This was what he'd wanted back in 2008, when the walls were closing in and he couldn't breathe. A fresh start, a clean slate, a life without the weight of failure crushing him. But underneath the contentment was a thin layer of ice, fragile and treacherous, because this life, no matter how real it felt, was built on a lie. John Alvarez's social security number belonged to a baby who died in 1975. His driver's license was a forgery, good enough to pass cursory inspection, but that would never survive serious scrutiny. His marriage to Sarah wasn't legally valid. His adoption of Kyle was fraudulent. If anyone ever looked closely, really looked, the entire structure would collapse. That night, after the kids were asleep and Sarah was reading in bed, John stood in the bathroom brushing his teeth and caught his reflection in the mirror again. For just a moment, he saw past the beard and the gray hair and the lines, saw the face of Jonathan Rivera staring back at him, 34 years old, terrified, drowning in debts and lies, making the worst decision of his life. He'd told himself it would be temporary, that he'd disappear for a few months, let things cool down, maybe send Camilla an anonymous message somehow to let her know he was alive. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and with each passing day, going back became more impossible. The life insurance would have paid out. She'd have moved on. Walking back into her life would destroy her all over again, and for what? So he could face criminal charges, civil lawsuits, the disgust of everyone who'd ever known him? So he'd stayed John Alvarez, built a life, fell in love, had a family, and tried not to think about the woman he'd left behind, the life he'd abandoned, the man he used to be. He spit toothpaste into the sink and rinsed his mouth. When he looked up again, he saw only John. Jonathan was gone, buried so deep that some days John could almost believe he'd never existed at all. "You okay?" Sarah called from the bedroom. "Yeah," he called back. "Just tired. Be there in a minute." He turned off the bathroom light and walked toward the bed, toward his wife, toward the life he'd stolen and made his own. Behind him, in the darkness, Jonathan Rivera's ghost lingered for just a moment longer before dissolving into nothing. Daniel Foster had been an investigative journalist for 18 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. When something felt off, it usually was. That's what brought him to the cramped office of a document forger named Eddie Vance in Fort Lauderdale on a humid afternoon in March 2022. Eddie was a nervous man in his 60s, rail-thin with yellowed fingers from decades of chain smoking. He'd agreed to speak with Daniel for a story about identity fraud in Florida, on the condition that his face wouldn't be shown and his real name wouldn't be used. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. "The fake ID business has changed," Eddie was saying, smoke curling from the cigarette dangling between his lips. Used to be you could make a decent living doing driver's licenses for college kids who wanted to drink. Now, with all the security features, holograms, that shit, it's harder. You need better equipment, better connections. Daniel nodded, his recorder running on the table between them. But there's still demand? Oh, hell yeah, but different demand. Now it's mostly people who need to disappear. Domestic violence victims, whistleblowers, people running from debt or the law. He paused, studying Daniel. You'd be surprised how many people want to stop being themselves. Can you give me an example? No names, just, there was this guy back in 08, 09. Eddie scratched his stubbled chin. Came to me through a mutual contact. Needed a complete identity package, driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, the works. Paid cash. 20 grand, which was top dollar even then. Daniel leaned forward. What made him stand out? He was scared. Really scared. Not like the usual deadbeats trying to dodge child support. This guy was running from something serious. He had this look in his eyes like a trapped animal. Eddie took a long drag. I remember he wanted a Hispanic name. Said he needed to blend in somewhere with a lot of people who looked like him. I set him up with the name John Alvarez. Something in Daniel's chest tightened. Do you remember what he looked like? Nah, man. That was, 13 years ago? I've done hundreds of IDs since then. Eddie stubbed out his cigarette. Why? You thinking this is something? Daniel wasn't sure yet, but he filed the information away. The interview continued for another hour, covering the technical aspects of document forgery, the dark web marketplaces, the ways people could reinvent themselves with enough money and desperation. Back at his apartment in Miami Beach, Daniel transcribed the interview and began pulling threads. John Alvarez. The name was common enough, probably thousands of them across the United States. But Eddie had said 2008, and he'd said the man was Hispanic, scared, running from something serious. Daniel had covered enough missing persons cases to know that 2008 had been a significant year in Miami. He opened his files from old stories, scrolling through the cases that had never been solved. There were dozens. Miami had no shortage of people who vanished into thin air. But one case stopped him cold. Jonathan Rivera, missing since August 2008. Car found abandoned near the beach, phone and wallet left behind. Local businessman, thousands in debt, suspected kidnapping. The case had gone cold after months of investigation, and Rivera had been declared dead in 2014. Daniel pulled up photos from the original news coverage. Jonathan Rivera had been 34. Dark hair, brown eyes, clean-shaven. A handsome man with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes in the later photos, the ones taken months before he disappeared. Daniel could see the strain in those images, the weight of whatever he'd been carrying. Could Jonathan Rivera have become John Alvarez? It was a long shot, probably nothing, but Daniel's instincts were humming and he'd learned not to ignore them. He started digging deeper, pulling court records, bankruptcy filings, anything he could find on Jonathan Rivera's final months. The picture that emerged was grim. A man drowning in debt, taking out loans from questionable sources, mortgaging everything he owned. A man who might have had reason to disappear. Daniel filed a records request with the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles, searching for anyone named John Alvarez, who'd been issued a driver's license in 2008 or 2009. The results came back 3 weeks later. 47 John Alvarez's in that time frame. It would take months to track them all down. He decided to approach it differently. If Jonathan Rivera had created a new identity, he'd need to establish a credit history, employment records, a paper trail that made John Alvarez seem real. Daniel used his access to public records databases, a perk of investigative journalism, and started searching for John Alvarez's in Florida with thin credit files that started around 2008 or 2009. He found 6 possibilities. One by one, he tracked them down. 2 were immigrants with legitimate documentation. 3 were actual John Alvarez's who'd simply been late bloomers in establishing credit. The 6th led to a dead end. No current address, no recent activity, as if the person had existed briefly and then vanished. Daniel was about to give up when he expanded his search beyond Florida. If Rivera had wanted to truly disappear, he wouldn't have stayed in state. He'd have gone somewhere else, somewhere he could blend in and start over. Texas. The thought came suddenly. Texas had a large Hispanic population, a strong economy, and was far enough from Miami to feel safe but close enough to reach by car or bus. Daniel refined his search parameters, looking for John Alvarez's in Texas with credit histories starting in 2009. The results were overwhelming, hundreds of possibilities. But Daniel was patient. He'd learned that good investigative work was 90% tedious research and 10% breakthrough. He started with East Texas, methodically working through each name, checking employment records, property ownership, anything that might indicate someone building a new life from scratch. And then he found him, John Alvarez, Longview, Texas, real estate agent. Credit history beginning in 2009 with a secured credit card and a small personal loan. Property purchase in 2011, a modest house on Cypress Street paid in cash. Marriage license filed in 2010 to Sarah Patterson. Business license for real estate filed in 2012. Daniel pulled up the real estate agency's website. There he was, John Alvarez, smiling in a professional headshot, beard neatly trimmed, eyes hidden behind stylish glasses. The photo was recent, probably taken within the last year or two. Daniel opened a photo of Jonathan Rivera from 2008 in another window and placed them side by side. The beard changed the face significantly, and 14 years had added weight and age. But the eyes were the same shape, the ears identical, the bone structure unmistakable. He used photo analysis software to compare the facial features, the distance between the eyes, the width of the nose, the proportions of the face. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close, very close. Close enough that Daniel's pulse was racing. He spent the next 2 weeks confirming every detail he could find. He called John Alvarez's real estate office, posing as a potential client interested in properties in the Longview area. The secretary scheduled a phone consultation, and when John called at the appointed time, Daniel listened carefully to his voice, recording the conversation. "Mr. Alvarez, thanks for taking the time," Daniel said smoothly. "I'm looking to relocate from Florida, actually. Orlando area. Just want to get away from the hurricanes, you know?" "I understand completely," John replied, his voice friendly and professional. "East Texas is beautiful country, and we don't get hurricanes here. What kind of property are you looking for?" They talked for 20 minutes about real estate, school districts, the local economy. John was knowledgeable, personable, exactly what you'd want in a real estate agent. But Daniel was listening for something else. Any hint of a Miami accent? Any slip that might reveal who this man really was? When the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at his notes. He had a hunch, a strong one, but hunches weren't evidence. He needed proof. He needed to see John Alvarez in person, close enough to be certain. Daniel booked a flight to Dallas and rented a car for the drive to Longview. He told his editor at the Miami Herald that he was following up on the identity fraud story, which was technically true. What he didn't mention was that he might be about to crack one of Miami's most famous cold cases. Longview was exactly what Daniel expected, a small city where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where the pace of life was slower, and people still said hello to strangers on the street. He checked into a Holiday Inn Express and spent the evening researching the town, John Alvarez's business, his family. Sarah Alvarez taught 3rd grade at Pine Tree Elementary. They had 2 children, a teenage boy and a preteen daughter. By all accounts, they were a normal, happy family. John was involved in the community, attended the Baptist church on Main Street, coached his son's little league team years ago. He was respected, trusted, successful. If this was Jonathan Rivera, he'd built an impressive second life. The next morning, Daniel drove to the real estate office where John worked. It was in a strip mall off Highway 259, sandwiched between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Through the large front windows, Daniel could see into the office. A few desks, motivational posters on the walls, a woman at the reception desk. He parked across the street and waited. At 9:47 a.m., a white Ford F-150 pulled into the parking lot. A man got out, tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing khakis and a blue button-down shirt. He had a beard, gray-streaked, and wore glasses. He moved with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Daniel raised his camera, a professional model with a telephoto lens, and started shooting. He captured the man's profile as he walked toward the office, his face as he paused to answer a phone call, the moment he laughed at whatever the person on the other end said. Then the man looked directly at Daniel's car. Their eyes met for just a second before the man continued into the office, but it was enough. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen that look before, in hundreds of interviews with people hiding something. It was a flicker of fear, quickly masked, but unmistakable. Daniel spent the rest of the day gathering footage and photos. He followed John to a showing in a nearby neighborhood, watching through his camera as he walked potential clients through a 2-story colonial. He captured him stopping for lunch at a Mexican restaurant, eating alone while scrolling through his phone. He photographed him returning to the office, leaving at 5:30, driving home to the house on Cypress Street. That evening, Daniel uploaded all the photos to his laptop and used facial recognition software, comparing them to the images of Jonathan Rivera from 2008. The software confirmed what his instincts had been screaming. This was the same man, 14 years older, hidden behind a beard and glasses and a carefully constructed new identity. But the same man. Jonathan Rivera hadn't been kidnapped. He hadn't drowned in the ocean or been killed by loan sharks. He'd simply walked away from his life and built a new one under a stolen name. Daniel sat in his hotel room, staring at the evidence spread across his laptop screen, and felt the weight of what he'd discovered. This story would destroy lives, not just Jonathan's, but Sarah's, their children's. It would rip apart a family that had done nothing wrong except exist on a foundation of lies. But it was also the truth, and Daniel was a journalist. The truth was what he did. He opened his laptop and began to write. The article published on a Tuesday morning in June 2022 on the Miami Herald's website with the headline, "Missing Miami Businessman Found Alive in Texas After 14 Years, Living Under Assumed Identity." Daniel Foster had spent weeks refining every word, verifying every fact, consulting with editors and the Herald's legal team. The story was airtight. Facial recognition analysis from 3 independent experts, documentation tracing John Alvarez's identity back to a deceased infant, financial records showing the impossibility of John Alvarez existing before 2009, and most damning of all, high-resolution photographs that left no doubt this was Jonathan Rivera. The article went viral within hours. By noon, it was trending on Twitter. By evening, every major news outlet in the country was covering it. CNN sent a crew to Longview. Fox News interviewed Detective Marcus Webb, now retired but still following the case he'd never been able to solve. The story had everything: mystery, betrayal, a man who'd faked his own death and gotten away with it for over a decade. In Jacksonville, Camila Rivera's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She'd been at work. She managed a bookstore now, a quiet life she'd carefully constructed from the ruins of her past. When her assistant told her that reporters were calling, that something had happened with Jonathan's case, she'd locked herself in the back office and read Daniel Foster's article 3 times, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. The photos stared back at her. Jonathan, older, but unmistakably him, standing in front of a real estate office in Texas. Jonathan with a beard and glasses. Jonathan alive. Not dead, not kidnapped, not murdered by loan sharks or drowned in the ocean. Just gone, by choice. Living another life while she'd spent 14 years grieving, wondering, torturing herself with what-ifs and maybes. The rage hit her like a physical force. She swept everything off her desk: papers, her computer monitor, the framed photo of the mountains she'd hiked last year in North Carolina. The crash brought her assistant running, but Camila waved her away, tears streaming down her face, a sound emerging from her throat that was somewhere between a scream and a sob. He'd left her, deliberately, callously, completely. He'd let her think he was dead. He'd watched her on television begging for his return and done nothing. He'd collected life insurance, her life insurance, money that should have been hers, and used it to start over while she'd lost everything: the house, her savings, her sense of reality. And he'd done it all while building a new family, a wife who wasn't her, children who called him dad, a whole life that had nothing to do with the vows they'd made, the future they'd planned. Camila's lawyer called within the hour. "We need to talk about your legal options," he said. "This is fraud on a massive scale. Identity theft, insurance fraud, falsifying death records. I want him prosecuted," Camila said, her voice cold and flat. "I want him to pay for what he did. We'll make that happen. The state attorney's office is already involved. But Camila, I need to prepare you. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Every detail of your marriage, your finances, your life, it's going to be public. The media circus has just begun." He was right. By the next morning, reporters were camped outside her apartment building. They shouted questions as she left for work, cameras flashing in her face. What did she feel about Jonathan being alive? Did she want to see him? Did she know about the debts? Had she suspected he might have run away? She gave one statement, standing on the steps of the bookstore with her lawyer beside her. "Jonathan Rivera is a coward who destroyed my life and the lives of everyone who loved him." I spent 14 years mourning a man who chose to abandon me rather than face his problems. I will be pursuing every legal avenue available to hold him accountable for his actions." The video played on every news channel. Camilla watched herself that evening, a 50-year-old woman who looked older, harder, her face set in lines of barely controlled fury, and barely recognized the young wife who'd pleaded for her husband's safe return all those years ago. That woman had been soft, hopeful, naive. This woman knew better. Woman knew. In Longview, John Alvarez's world imploded with terrifying speed. He'd been showing a property when his phone started buzzing incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails piling up. He'd excused himself, stepped into the empty garage of the house, and opened the first message. It was from his broker. "Call me now, emergency." Then he saw the news alert on his phone. "Missing Miami man found in Texas." His hands went numb. The phone nearly slipped from his grasp. This couldn't be happening. He'd been so careful. 14 years of caution, of never slipping, of being John Alvarez so completely that Jonathan Rivera was just a ghost. But the ghost had found him. He got into his truck and drove. Not to the office, not home, just drove aimlessly through Longview's streets while his phone continued to explode with notifications. He finally pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed grocery store and forced himself to read Daniel Foster's article. Every detail was there, every lie exposed. Photos of him taken without his knowledge. Quotes from facial recognition experts. His real name, his past, his debts, his disappearance, and worst of all, mentions of Sarah and the kids. Their names in print, their lives about to be torn apart. His phone rang. Sarah. He stared at her name on the screen, unable to make himself answer. What could he possibly say? How could he explain 14 years of deception? The call went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, she called again. Then again. On the fourth call, he answered. "John?" Her voice was strange, high-pitched with panic. "John, what's happening? There are reporters outside the house. They're saying you're someone else. They're saying you faked your death. They're saying you have another wife. Sarah, I need you to listen to me. Is it true?" She was crying now. "Please tell me it's not true. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake." The silence stretched between them, heavy and damning. He couldn't lie anymore. The lies had run out. "It's true," he whispered. The sound she made was like something breaking. "Oh my God. Oh my God. Who are you? Who have I been married to? I'm still me. I'm still the man you married. I'm still Kyle and Emma's father." "You're not their father," Sarah screamed. "You're a liar. You're a criminal. I don't even know your real name. It's Jonathan Rivera. Get away from my house. Get away from my children. If you come near us, I'm calling the police." "Sarah, please." She hung up. He tried calling back, but she didn't answer. He sat in his truck, shaking as everything he'd built crumbled around him. His phone kept ringing. His broker, his clients, reporters who'd somehow gotten his number. He turned it off and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, paid cash for a room, and locked himself inside. The story dominated the news cycle for days. Nancy Grace devoted an entire episode to it, bringing on experts to discuss the psychology of men who abandon their families. Dr. Phil reached out to Sarah, offering support and a platform if she wanted to tell her story. The Miami Herald published follow-up articles detailing Jonathan's debts, his connections to loan sharks, the elaborate planning that must have gone into his disappearance. Detective Marcus Webb gave interviews from his retirement home in Coral Springs, explaining how they'd searched for months, how they'd suspected foul play, how Jonathan's car abandoned near the beach had seemed to point towards suicide or kidnapping. "We never considered that he might have just walked away," Webb admitted. "We gave him too much credit. We thought he loved his wife too much to put her through that." The legal machinery began grinding forward. The Florida State Attorney's Office announced they would be seeking Jonathan Rivera's extradition from Texas to face charges of insurance fraud, falsifying official records, and identity theft. The FBI got involved because of the interstate nature of the crimes and the use of a stolen Social Security number. Civil suits started piling up. Camilla's attorney filed first, seeking restitution for emotional damages and return of the insurance payout with interest. Sarah filed for divorce within a week, claiming fraud and seeking to have the marriage annulled on grounds that it had never been legal in the first place. She took the children and moved in with her sister and Tyler, 40 miles away, refusing all media requests and shielding the kids from the cameras as best she could. Kyle and Emma's faces appeared in a few photos despite Sarah's efforts. They looked shell-shocked, confused, like children who'd woken up in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Kyle had been forced to quit the baseball team when reporters started showing up at practices. Emma stopped going to dance class. Their entire world had been revealed as a lie, and everyone in their small town knew it. Jonathan hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Vance who specialized in white-collar crime. She advised him to stay silent, to not speak to the media, to let her handle everything. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The facial recognition analysis was bulletproof. The paper trail was clear. His own wife, his real wife, was demanding prosecution. "Your best option is a plea deal," Patricia told him during their third meeting. "The state wants someone to pay for this, and you're it. We can probably negotiate down to reduce charges, maybe avoid prison time if we emphasize that no one was physically harmed, that you were desperate. I destroyed 2 families," Jonathan said quietly. "I let Camilla think I was dead for 14 years. I married Sarah under false pretenses. I raised children who weren't legally mine. I committed fraud on a massive scale. How do I avoid prison time?" Patricia sighed. "Because the system is more interested in punishment than justice. And your story, as terrible as it is, has sympathetic elements. You weren't a monster. You were a desperate man who made catastrophic choices. We work that angle." The extradition hearing took place in a Texas courtroom in July. Jonathan waived his right to fight it, agreeing to return to Florida voluntarily. Patricia arranged for him to surrender himself rather than being arrested, a small dignity in the midst of disgrace. Before he left Texas, he tried one last time to see Sarah and the kids. He drove to her sister's house in Tyler, parked down the street, and called her phone. "I have nothing to say to you," Sarah said when she answered. "I know, but I need to say something to you. To them. Please. Kyle doesn't want to talk to you. Emma cries every time someone mentions your name. You're not their father, Jonathan. You were never their father. Their father was a fiction, a character you played. I loved them, that was real." "No," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't build a life on someone else's identity. Love doesn't let children believe in something that never existed. You're not capable of love. You're only capable of running away." She hung up. He sat in his truck for an hour, hoping to catch a glimpse of them, but no one emerged from the house. Finally, a police car pulled up behind him, and an officer approached his window. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move along. We've had a complaint about a suspicious vehicle." Jonathan looked at the officer's young face and saw no recognition, no awareness that he was looking at the man who dominated news cycles for weeks. Just another suspicious stranger in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. He drove away from Sarah's sister's house, away from the life he'd built, away from the family that would never forgive him. 2 days later, he boarded a plane to Miami with Patricia beside him, federal marshals waiting to take him into custody when he landed. As the plane lifted off, Jonathan stared out the window at Texas disappearing beneath the clouds. Somewhere down there, his children were learning to live without him. His wife was erasing every trace of their life together. The man he'd pretended to be was dying, and Jonathan Rivera, criminal, coward, the man who destroyed everything he touched, was all that remained. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse was surrounded by media on the morning of Jonathan Rivera's arraignment. Satellite trucks lined the street, reporters jockeying for position behind police barricades, cameras trained on every entrance. It was September 2022, 3 months since Daniel Foster's article had blown the case wide open, and the public's appetite for the story hadn't diminished. Jonathan emerged from a black SUV in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals. He'd lost weight during his time in custody. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken. The beard he'd worn for 14 years had been shaved off at Patricia Vance's insistence, revealing the face that Miami remembered, aged and broken, but unmistakably Jonathan Rivera. The crowd erupted. People shouted from behind the barricades, some hurling insults, others demanding justice, a few holding signs with Camilla's face and the words, "Justice for Camilla." One woman, maybe in her 60s, screamed that he was a monster, that men like him deserved to rot. Jonathan kept his eyes down as the marshals rushed him toward the courthouse entrance. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back, sketch artists positioned for the best views since cameras weren't allowed. Jonathan sat at the defense table between Patricia and her junior associate, a young man named Marcus who'd been helping with research. Across the aisle, the prosecution team sat ready. 3 assistant state attorneys led by Catherine Wells, a veteran prosecutor known for her aggressive approach to white-collar crime. And in the gallery, third row on the left, sat Camila Rivera. Jonathan felt her presence before he saw her. When he finally forced himself to turn and look, their eyes met for the first time in 14 years. She was older, her dark hair now streaked with gray, lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. She wore a simple black dress and no jewelry. Her expression was carved from stone. No tears, no rage, just a cold, unwavering stare that seemed to look straight through him. He tried to hold her gaze, to communicate something, apology, regret, anything, but she looked away, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he'd ceased to exist. The message was clear. He was nothing to her anymore. Less than nothing. Judge Martha Hendricks entered and everyone rose. She was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, appointed to the bench after 20 years as a prosecutor. She'd seen every variety of human weakness and criminal behavior, and her reputation suggested she had little patience for either. The arraignment was procedural, but intense. Catherine Wells outlined the charges: insurance fraud, obtaining property by fraud, falsifying official documents, identity theft, grand theft, and making false statements to law enforcement. Each charge carried potential prison time. Combined, Jonathan was looking at up to 20 years. Patricia entered a plea of not guilty, a formality while they continued negotiating with the prosecution. Judge Hendricks set bail at $500,000, a number that might as well have been $5 million for a man whose assets had been frozen and whose reputation ensured no one would help him. Mr. Rivera will remain in custody pending trial, Hendricks announced. Next hearings scheduled for October 15th were adjourned. The marshals moved to return Jonathan to custody, but Catherine Wells stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Camila Rivera would like to make a victim impact statement, if the court permits. Hendricks glanced at Camila, then nodded. Keep it brief, Mrs. Rivera. This is an arraignment, not sentencing. Camila rose, and the courtroom fell silent. She didn't approach the podium but spoke from where she stood, her voice steady and clear. In August 2008, my husband disappeared. For weeks I thought he'd been kidnapped or killed. I barely ate or slept. I went on television begging for his safe return. When they found his car with his phone and wallet inside, I thought I'd never see him again. I mourned him. I grieved for the man I loved, the life we'd built together, the future we'd planned. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed forward. Then they declared him legally dead, and I had to bury an empty casket. I had to tell our families, our friends, that Jonathan was gone forever. I had to learn to live with the hole he'd left in my life. She paused, her hands gripping the back of the bench in front of her. Except he wasn't gone. He was in Texas, building a new life, a new family, while I was here drowning in the debt he'd left behind. He watched me suffer. He knew what he'd done to me, and he chose to let it continue. For 14 years. Now she looked directly at Jonathan, and the coldness in her eyes was worse than any anger could have been. You're not the man I married. That man had courage, integrity, honor. You're a coward who destroyed everyone who made the mistake of loving you. And I hope you spend every day of whatever sentence you receive thinking about what you took from me, from all of us. She sat down, and the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Even the reporters in the gallery seemed stunned. Judge Hendricks cleared her throat. Thank you, Mrs. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, I hope you were listening. Court adjourned. The gavel came down, and Jonathan was led away, Camila's words echoing in his mind. You're a coward. A coward. He'd spent 14 years running from that truth, but there was nowhere left to run. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal maneuvering. Patricia worked tirelessly on a plea deal, meeting repeatedly with Catherine Wells and her team. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no scenario where Jonathan walked away free. The question was how much time he would serve and what charges he'd ultimately plead to. They're willing to drop some of the charges if you plead guilty to insurance fraud and identity theft, Patricia told him during a meeting at the jail. They're recommending 5 years with possibility of parole after 3. It's a good deal, Jonathan. The best we're going to get. What about restitution? Full return of the insurance payout plus interest, approximately $400,000. You'll be paying that off for the rest of your life, but it's better than 20 years in prison. Jonathan stared at the gray walls of the meeting room. 5 years. 3 if he was lucky. It seemed both impossibly long and not nearly long enough for what he'd done. What about Sarah and the kids? Patricia's expression softened slightly. Sarah's attorney has been in touch. She's not pressing any additional charges, but she wants you to sign papers terminating any parental rights to Kyle. Emma's not legally your child anyway, but Kyle, the adoption was fraudulent, so it's being dissolved. He's not going to understand, Jonathan said quietly. He's 16. He thinks I'm his dad. You're not his dad. You never were, legally speaking. And frankly, after what you've put that family through, you should be grateful Sarah isn't pursuing damages. She has grounds. Jonathan knew she was right. He signed the papers that afternoon, his signature relinquishing any claim to the boy he'd raised for 6 years. The boy who'd called him dad and asked his advice and trusted him completely. Another casualty of Jonathan Rivera's catastrophic selfishness. The plea hearing was scheduled for late October. This time, the media presence was smaller. The story had lost some of its urgency as other scandals and tragedies captured public attention. But Camilla was there again in the same seat, wearing the same expression of cold disdain. Jonathan stood before Judge Hendricks and entered his guilty plea. The words felt hollow in his mouth. Guilty, Your Honor. Guilty of fraud. Guilty of theft. Guilty of destroying lives. Catherine Wells presented the agreed-upon sentence. 5 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release, full restitution to Camilla Rivera, and permanent surrender of any claim to the John Alvarez identity or assets acquired under that name. Judge Hendricks accepted the plea without comment. Mr. Rivera, do you understand that you're giving up your right to a trial? That this guilty plea means you're accepting responsibility for these crimes? Yes, Your Honor. Do you have anything you'd like to say before I impose sentence? Jonathan had prepared a statement with Patricia's help, but looking at Camilla's face in the gallery, he knew no words would matter. Still, he had to try. I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt. To Camilla, who deserved better than what I gave her. To Sarah and her children, who built a life with someone who didn't truly exist. To my family, my friends, everyone who mourned me and searched for me. His voice was shaking now. I was drowning in debt and fear, and I made the worst possible choice. I chose to run instead of face my problems. I chose to let people think I was dead instead of admitting I'd failed. He paused, trying to find words that might mean something. I know I can't undo the damage. I know apologies are meaningless. But I want everyone to know that the guilt I feel, the shame, it's with me every second of every day, and it will be for the rest of my life. Silence followed his words. Judge Hendricks looked at him with an expression that might have been pity or disgust. He couldn't tell which. Mr. Rivera, in my 23 years on the bench, I've seen a lot of cases. Murders, assaults, heinous crimes. But what you did, it's a different kind of violence. You killed yourself in a way, and let everyone who loved you attend your funeral. You let your wife grieve and struggle and rebuild her life from ruins you created. And then you went and did it again to another woman, another family. She shook her head slowly. The only mercy I can find in this situation is that no one died by your hand. But that's cold comfort to the people whose lives you devastated. You will serve 5 years in federal prison. You will pay restitution, and you will spend the rest of your life living with what you've done. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. Marshals moved to take Jonathan away, but before they reached him, Camilla stood. She walked down the aisle toward the defense table, and Patricia tensed, clearly unsure what was about to happen. But Camilla stopped a few feet away, looking at Jonathan with those cold, dead eyes. I forgive you, she said quietly, and Jonathan felt a flash of relief until she continued. Not for you, for me, because I refuse to let you take up any more space in my life, my thoughts, my heart. You're nothing to me now, less than a stranger, and that's worse than any hatred I could feel. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Jonathan watched her go, understanding that her forgiveness was the final, most complete rejection possible. She was done with him, completely, utterly done. Federal Prison Camp Montgomery, Alabama. That's where they sent him. A minimum security facility that housed white-collar criminals, non-violent offenders, people who'd made terrible choices but weren't considered dangerous. Jonathan arrived in November 2022, processed through intake, issued his uniform, assigned to a cell he'd share with a former accountant who'd embezzled from his employer. The first months were the hardest. Learning the routines, the hierarchies, the unspoken rules of prison life. Jonathan kept his head down, worked in the library, attended the required counseling sessions where a board psychologist asked him questions about his choices and his feelings. He wrote letters, to Sarah, to Kyle, to Emma, but never sent them. What could he possibly say? He'd destroyed their trust so completely that words were meaningless. The letters piled up in his cell, a stack of unsent apologies and explanations that would never be enough. Occasionally, other inmates recognized him from the news coverage. "You're that guy," they'd say, "the one who faked his death." Some were impressed, as if he'd pulled off some kind of brilliant heist. Others were disgusted, especially the ones with families they'd been torn from. Jonathan avoided both groups, preferring solitude to judgment. His cellmate, Marcus, was one of the few who treated him like a normal person. "We all fucked up," Marcus said one night, both of them lying in their bunks staring at the ceiling. "That's why we're here. The difference is whether we learn from it or spend the rest of our lives making excuses." "What did you learn?" Jonathan asked. "That stealing is easier than earning, until it's not. That the money I took wasn't worth my family, my reputation, my freedom. That I was an idiot." Marcus laughed bitterly. "What about you?" Jonathan thought for a long time before answering. "That you can't run from yourself. You can change your name, your face, your whole life, but you're still you. And eventually that catches up." In Jacksonville, Camilla was learning to live again. The restitution money had come through. $400,000, enough to provide security and possibilities she hadn't had in years. She kept working at the bookstore because she liked it, but she also started traveling, seeing places she'd always wanted to visit. Iceland, New Zealand, Japan. She went on dates occasionally, though nothing serious. Trust was hard after what Jonathan had done, but she was trying, taking small steps toward a future that wasn't defined by what she'd lost. She never thought about Jonathan, if she could help it. He was a chapter in her life that had closed, a painful one, but over. She had no interest in his prison term, his redemption, his feelings. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. In Tyler, Texas, Sarah was doing the same. The divorce had been finalized, the house sold, the past buried as deeply as possible. Kyle had changed his last name back to Patterson, Sarah's maiden name, trying to distance himself from the man who'd pretended to be his father. Emma was in therapy, working through trust issues and abandonment fears. They were healing, slowly, the way families do after trauma. And in Montgomery, Alabama, Jonathan Rivera served his time day after day, knowing he'd forfeited any right to the life he'd tried to build on lies. He'd gambled everything on the fantasy that he could erase himself and start over, and he'd lost. The price was measured not just in years in prison, but in the faces of everyone he'd destroyed. Camilla, Sarah, Kyle, Emma, ghosts that would haunt him long after his sentence ended. He had 2 years left on his sentence when he received a letter. It was from Kyle, the first communication from any of them since his arrest. The letter was short. "I don't forgive you. I don't think I ever will. But Mom says I should tell you that I'm okay, that we're all okay. We're moving on. I'm in college now, playing baseball. Emma's doing better. Mom's dating someone who's actually honest. We're building lives that don't include you. I hope you understand that's what you wanted when you left. You wanted to disappear. So stay disappeared. We don't need a ghost haunting us anymore." Jonathan read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the box under his bunk where he kept the letters he'd never sent. Kyle was right. He'd wanted to disappear, and he had. The man he'd been in Miami, the man he'd pretended to be in Texas, both were gone. All that remained was this, a middle-aged man in a prison uniform, paying the price for thinking he could outrun his failures. The story of Jonathan Rivera became a cautionary tale, referenced in articles about insurance fraud, discussed in psychology journals about identity and escape, taught in law schools as an example of how desperation can lead to catastrophic choices. The case file remained in Miami-Dade archives, a reminder of how easily a life could unravel and how completely a person could deceive the world and themselves. But for those who'd lived through it, who'd been damaged by his choices, it was more than a story. It was a scar, a permanent mark left by a man who'd chosen cowardice over courage, fiction over truth, and in doing so, had destroyed everything real he'd ever possessed.